Here we are on the 21st of March, a year into lockdown. And right now we're going to look back. I don't know about you, but I am really excited about going forward. In fact, I'm excited about being back together again. I'm excited about meeting up with friends and family. I'm certainly excited about getting a haircut. You can see that's something that I desperately need. But it's important that we don't rush off ahead without looking back. And this is biblical, that we pause a moment to think about what has gone on behind us. And I want to share a few verses with you from 1 Thessalonians Chapter 4. And if you want to look that up while you're looking that up, I just want to share a story with you. Some of you know that I've had the immense privilege, and I do count it a privilege, to serve on the front line with our NHS during this pandemic as a hospital chaplain. And I've been called in lots of times to pray with those who are dying from the coronavirus. And it was particularly hard during lockdown 1 when families weren't able to be with their loved ones. And I remember one call that I got from a nurse saying that a patient was sadly dying, and she had some things that she wanted to confess. So I came in and spoke with her. Now, what I shared with her, I've shared with 100% of the patients that I prayed with, and something that I want to share with you today. And this lady who wanted to confess, she began the "Bless me, Father, for I've sinned," and we had to quickly clear up that she wasn't in fact after a Catholic priest, and that she was happy to continue talking with me. But I was able to explain to her that the creator of the universe, love himself, was right there in the room with us, and that she could confess those burdens that she had to him, and that he would listen, that he'd be faithful to respond, and that she could give her life to him even in those dying moments, and that she would have everlasting life and hope with him. And that lady died later that night. So what are these verses? And let's look at these verses together from 1 Thessalonians Chapter 4, verses 13 to 14. It says this: "Brothers and sisters, we do not want you to grieve like the rest of humankind who have no hope. For we believe that Jesus Christ died and rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him." Now Paul is giving us a double negative here. He's saying, don't grieve like the rest of humankind who have no hope. And what's interesting there is Paul's not saying, we shouldn't grieve, just have hope. Neither is he saying, don't be, it's hopeless, so let's all be miserable about death. But he is pointing out the fact that there are those in our world who are sadly grieving without any hope. And as Christians, we're called to grieve with hope. We are called to grieve. I don't know if you come across those people from time to time. I know I certainly do, who are afraid to talk about death, who are afraid of emotion, and they'll say things like, they've gone to a better place, and therefore, don't be upset, don't cry. Now, there's some truth in that, isn't there? That our loved ones do go on to a better place. They do go on to heaven, to that place that I was talking about just now with this lady. But the reality is that death was not part of God's original plan, and therefore grief is a natural part of looking back. And often when we talk about balancing between two things, we talk about not going to the extremes, but actually having a balance. But here Paul is encouraging us to go to the extreme of grief and to go to the extreme of hope, and holding those two extremes in tension with one another. It's fascinating when you stop to think about it. But it's not just the church. I hear this out in society as well. Death is natural. It's the circle of life. I'll tell you about one story, and this is a true story. It comes from some writings of Peter Kreeft, who's a Christian philosopher, and he talks about some friends of his. They aren't religious, and they sat their 7-year-old down, who had sadly lost his 3-year-old cousin who had died. And they tried to explain that death is natural. They tried to explain the circle of life. They even referenced the Lion King in their story, this idea that we go back to the ground, that we go back to the dust, and the plants eat it, and the circle continues. And the boy ran screaming out of the room and said, "I don't want to be fertilizer." Now, while there's something humorous about what the boy said, actually his reaction was deeply biblical. death isn't natural. Death isn't part of the original plan. And in fact, we just have to look at Jesus when he came to the graveside of his friend Lazarus. And we read there the shortest verse in the Bible that Jesus wept. Now we don't know to what degree Jesus wept, but he was deeply hurt to see the deep distortion of the creation that he created and that he loved. But that's not the only part of it. Yes, we're called to grieve, but we're also called to have hope. And we do have this hope. We read it here in this passage just now. For we believe that Jesus Christ died and rose again. Where, O death, is your sting, says Paul in other writings. Nothing can separate us from the love of God, neither death nor life. And this is a wonderful hope that we hang on to as Christians, not just for then, but for right now. That as we grieve, we have the hope that Jesus is with us in that process. We're going to sing in a moment a song, Sovereign Over Us. But before we do that, I'd love to pray this prayer with you. So let's pray now. Our Father, you are the strength of your people. And we ask now that you would heal the brokenhearted among us and bind up their wounds. We ask that you would grant to them, to all else, the vision of that life in which all tears are wiped away and all shadows have fled away. Raise us up in your Spirit's power now to follow you in hope and trust, and give us your loving power to protect us, your wise power to nurture us, your beauty to entrap us, your peace to fulfill us, and lift up our hearts in the light and the love of your presence. And we ask all this in the name of the one who is the resurrection and the life, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Here we are, the 21st of March, a year into lockdown, and I'd like to lead us in thinking about the present, the right now. Now, I'm sandwiched between Steve, who's been looking at the past with us, and Andy, that's going to be looking at the future. And that feeling of being between things might sum up what it feels like to be living our lives right now in COVID. I don't know how all of you are feeling this morning, but I wonder if you might recognise yourself in one of these lockdown quotes I found on social media. How about this one? What a year the last month has been. Or maybe this one resonates with you. I'm gradually becoming lazy, bored and depressed. And why not? How about simply, life's become a waiting room. It's ground to a halt. Or my personal favourite, the dog is now looking at me as if to say, and now you know why I chew the furniture. One of the truly unique things about this global pandemic is there's something that everyone has gone through together right across the world. No one's been untouched by it. No one's not had their life dramatically altered by it. Think for a moment about this time last year. It was a time when we didn't check for phone, wallet and mask before we left the house. When we had no idea what social distancing or Zoom was. And you never wore pyjama bottoms to a work meeting. The Apostle Paul, who knew one or two things about life upheavals, by the way, he begins Romans 12 by challenging Christians to stand out as different to the world around them. Paul says, now you're Jesus followers. Now Christ is king of your life. You no longer have to conform to the same patterns that the world does. What does that mean for us right now as we continue to live in a COVID world? Well, I think Paul nails it later on in this same chapter of Romans 12. Romans 12, verse 12, Paul says this: we are to be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, and faithful in prayer. Let's start with patient in affliction. I believe more than ever before, our world is crying out for patience right now. Yeah, we've all had the same experience of COVID, But at the same time, we haven't. We've all had vastly different experiences of COVID. Some of us have been working long and extended hours on the front line, in hospitals, in schools, supermarkets. And others of us, they've been shielding and able to leave the house at all. Some of us have been incredibly lonely during this period, desperate for company, while some of us have not been able to get a moment of peace to ourselves. I see the world becoming increasingly impatient and polarised. And we can be so eager to point the finger, can't we, to react to people who've experienced life in a different way to ourselves. But Paul says, hey, as Jesus followers, let's not conform to what others might be doing. Let's love. Let's show each other patience and understanding, both as a church, as we begin to try and navigate our way back to being together, but also with our friends and our families and our neighbours. What else does Paul say? He says, be joyful in hope. A sign of our current culture, the sea in which we find ourselves swimming, is this idea of my story. BBC News even has an entire section focusing on it, focusing on the lives of individual people, telling their story, what COVID means to them. We tell each other our stories every day, don't we? On Facebook and Snapchat and Twitter, from the walks we take to what we've had for breakfast. Our individual stories are important. It's great to hear them and it's good to tell them. But this year, well, it's been a year when we found they simply can't be relied on. How many of our stories have had unexpected twists and turns this year? Cancellations, disappointments, shocks. Well, Paul is swift to point out that as God followers, our own stories also fit in and belong to a bigger story, one where the ending's already written and hope is certain. What difference does that make for us right now today? It makes every difference in the world. We can remain joyful because we have hope. And then finally, Paul says, be faithful in prayer. One of the joys of this last year has been the opportunity to gather together virtually and pray with each other on a regular occasion. Last week, I was chatting to the owner of our local trip shop, and I asked how things were going, and she said a phrase that I've heard so often in the last year. She said, it is what it is. I wonder if you've heard that phrase too. It is what it is. As Christians, as followers of Jesus, that's simply not true. You see, we believe in a God who doesn't sit aside passively, but gets involved and intervenes in human history. We believe in a God who loves us and listens to us when we talk to him. We believe in a God who answers, who responds to us as we get down on our knees in prayer. We don't have to say, it is what it is. So what does lockdown look like right now today? As we hit a year's anniversary since we met together physically in that building we call Upton Vale. I think Paul would tell us there's a time to stand out and live life differently because we can. It's a time to be joyful in hope. It's a time to be patient in affliction. And it's a time to be faithful in prayer.
Good morning, everybody. 21st of March 2021, a year into the lockdown restrictions on what it means to be church. My job is to help us look forward this morning with hope. And I guess many of you would expect me to talk about the vaccine and how wonderful it is that it's rolling out so fast, and it soon means that we'll be able to meet together on a Sunday morning at Upton Vale Baptist Church, Torquay. And you'll be imagining that I was going to be talking about how brilliant it would be to sing together and not have to wear masks and hug one another and take communion and have coffee together and do all the things that we so look forward to doing. But I'm not. It's not that I'm not looking forward to those things. I really am. It's just that I don't believe that's where our hope is located. And what's more, if it is located there, how that will always disappoint. Let me explain. In the first century, when Jesus was teaching, there used to be a thing called a betrothal service, where before a marriage, a young man and a young woman and their families would have done all the arrangements, and there would be a public community ceremony, and then the young man would go back to his parents' house and build an extension on their house, and they would then, after they were married, they would go and live there. And in this betrothal service, the young man would say words like this: "I'm going to prepare a place for you, and I'm going to come back, and I'm going to take you to be with me so that you will be where I am." Hold in your mind that first century betrothal service wording as I read to you from John 14, words that Jesus spoke to his disciples just before that first Easter when he was to go to die on the cross for the sins of the world. And Jesus says this: "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you. But I am going to prepare a place for you, and I'm going to come back and take you to be with me so that you will be where I am. You know the way to the place that I am going." And Thomas at this moment interrupts and says, "We don't know where you're going, so how do we know the way?" And Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me." It's an astonishing passage as Jesus takes very familiar words from a betrothal service and applies it to him and his disciples. And he's saying two really important things. The first thing he's saying is that he is the unique and only way to come to a right relationship with God, the God who created and sustains the universe. "I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me." Christianity's understanding is that Jesus is the only way to God. But the second thing Jesus is saying is that he is going beyond death to prepare a place for his followers so that those who put their trust in Jesus would also not die but live with him forever. "I am going to prepare a place for you so that you will be where I am." It's an incredible promise that we find our home with God in Jesus, that's where our hope is located. All the way through history, in all the different expressions in different cultures of literature and music, this longing for home is a massive theme. You'll be able to think of songs that talk about a longing for home. You'll think about those adventure stories where people are overcoming great adversity to get home to their loved ones. Home, for most people, is associated with love and happiness and security, and people long to get home. And one of the difficult things about lockdown for so many people has been that we can't get home. That we've been separated from loved ones. It's been really difficult. In our family, the Hickford family, we have 3 children, all with husbands and wives, partners, and we've been struggling with that thing during lockdown over this last year of not being able to meet together. And it's been really interesting that just halfway through a working day, a random picture would come up from the past as we've been bound together by this sense of nostalgia. Wouldn't it be lovely to all be home together again? And the added complication for us as a family is that our family home was sold. We don't go there anymore because it's not ours. And though when restrictions allow us, our kids might come to Torquay. They like Torquay, but it's not their home. And so there's been this subtext of where is our home? How do we find our way home? This nostalgia, this longing. And what's naturally happened in us in the church is that during lockdown we've longed and anticipated getting back to UV, being able to do the things we used to love and find our identity and meaning in and all of those things. And that's a perfectly natural reaction to lockdown, that we would long to be home, long to be back to the familiar, long to be back together. But actually, C.S. Lewis says that these longings for home really need to be carefully watched, because actually they're a inbuilt homing beacon in every human being, which is a little prompt and a reminder that this earth is not our home, This world is not our home, that actually the promises of John 14 are true, and that we will only find our home when we come to meet Jesus and we know that we will be with him forever. That's our home. C.S. Lewis says, our longings for home easily get misdirected. And when they get misdirected, they will always disappoint, because guess what? When we go home, people have changed, circumstances have changed, the place has changed. We can never go back and recreate what we had. We can only move forward, and we will only be able to do that healthily and well when we know that our home is with God forever in Jesus. One of the things that we've learnt as a family this year is that we can't go back. We can't recreate the past. Our family home is sold. But home is being together. And we are looking forward to restrictions easing so that we're able to be home together again. And so this morning I want to locate our hope in the right place. Yes, I am hopeful. I'm looking forward to going back to being church. It won't be the same. It can't be the same. So much has changed. But we will be home because Jesus is present with us. And whenever we are present with Jesus, we are home. And that is an anticipation now of our ultimate hope. That, as one writer put it, each night I pitch my tent a day's journey nearer home. One day we will be home. One day there will be no more tears and no more pain. One day we will hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant," because of all that Jesus has done in and through us. One day we will be home, and it's really important that we locate that hope in the right place. Home is not a place. It's not even familiarity. Home is where Jesus is, and that's our hope.